Lesson 97, Algebraic Addition, is a very important lesson. This lesson is setting you up for success when you get into an algebra class, because the adding or combining of signed numbers is a crucial basic skill to your success in algebra. In the book, there's an algebraic addition activity about combining positive and negative charges. It's just one way to think about this. Everyone's mind works differently, so it's good to find a model that makes sense to you. The one in the book is a little game about combining negative and positive charges. It doesn't really lend itself to this video, so I'm using a different teaching activity here, but the game would be a fun thing to play, but it would be better to play it in a situation where you had someone playing with you or doing it as a group. So again, it's collecting positive and negatives and seeing how all of that works. The next lesson, 98, I believe, will deal with a number line model, but I'm just going to talk a little bit now about algebraic addition and dealing with signed numbers. Numbers that are greater than 0 are mostly the numbers that you've been dealing with since you were in kindergarten or even preschool. They're called our counting numbers or natural numbers. And when you put 0 in, they become whole numbers. But now we're moving into the area of something called integers, where we're dealing with whole numbers and counting numbers, and they're what we call their opposites. In other words, every positive number that you have known since you were in kindergarten has an opposite negative number that you really haven't talked about much. So when I see positive 1, there's an opposite to it called negative 1. But numbers greater than 0 are always written with a positive sign, which you've always probably seen and called a plus sign. And sometimes we write them with no sign at all. And I find that sometimes things we don't write are even more confusing than things we do because we've never seen them there. We forget, we don't think about them. But any number that we see without a sign in front of it at all is assumed to be positive and could have a plus sign or a positive sign in front of it. Numbers that are less than 0 are hard to understand when you're really little because you can't lay down -3 of something. It's a little hard to understand. I can hand you 3 buttons or 3 pennies, or you can count 3 fingers. But when I say I have -3, it's harder to show that. And so we always teach it more as takeaway or subtraction. And so then when we come to the concept of negative, we are sometimes a little bit confused about a negative number. It is really functionally much like subtraction. Numbers less than 0 are always written with a negative sign. We never write them with no sign like we do positive numbers because that's left for the assumption that all unsigned numbers are assumed to be positive. So you'll only know it's a negative number if it has a negative sign in front of it. You will know it's a positive number if it has a sign or has no sign at all. So when an algebraic expression represents the addition or subtraction of positive and negative numbers, we look at the sign of the number to determine the mathematical operation we use to simplify the expression. This can become very confusing, and it'd be nice if we could just simplify it a little bit. But it depends on what we're representing. If it's in a word problem, sometimes it technically matters. Is the thing negative or positive? Are we adding or subtracting? But once we're down to just symbols, we just simplify it to whatever works. We're looking for the difference always between the two numbers, and then we decide whether that difference represents a positive or a negative. But they're going to show it to you in a number of ways, and we'll see which one makes sense to you, and that's the one model that works for you and probably ought to be what you stick with. Sometimes we enclose numbers in parentheses so that the sign of the number or the negative sign can be expressed separately from the operating sign. So this is confusing. We have a negative sign and we have an operating sign. And it's a little confusing because they're both what we've always looked at as minus. We've always called it minus 2, minus 2, minus 2. That's the operating symbol, but it's also the negative sign, and they actually work exactly the same way. And so sometimes I think we confuse ourselves because we think now that they mean something different, but it's really two ways to say the same thing. So let's look at some examples and how we could read them. This first example has plus 2 equals plus 2, and they look identical, except you'll notice they've left a little space here. What they're implying there is that this one is plus 2 and this one is positive 2. Is there any difference between plus 2 and positive 2? In a practical sense, no. They mean exactly the same thing. But if we're trying to express that we're adding 2, we might put a space in between there and say plus 2. And then we're saying that the answer is positive 2. But plus 2 is the same as positive 2. It equals positive 2. So it gets kind of like picky and technical and a little frustrating because it's as if you're trying to imply they're different and yet saying they're equivalent. So it's a little bit uncomfortable or unfamiliar. But plus 2 is the same as positive 2. Now we have positive. We have a plus sign out here, the operator, positive 2, and that also equals positive 2. Because if I add or plus a positive 2, it's still going to equal positive 2. Because I haven't added anything to it. If I put something out in front here, I would change the value. Like if I said 1 plus positive 2, that would be positive 3. But really and truly what's saying here is that this plus sign in front of the 2 and the plus sign in front of that 2, we normally don't write. That's the no sign at all part. Normally we would just say plus 2 equals 2. If there was nothing in front of the plus 2, it would be like 0 plus 2 equals 2. Now we have another double sign down here. We have a negative or minus out in front of a negative 2. So what is minus negative 2? Now that's more confusing because here plus plus did not change anything. But minus minus does. Because minus is taking away and negative 2 is the opposite of 2. So if we're taking away the opposite of 2, we're saying the opposite of 2, we get positive 2. So what we can memorize, for those of you that just need to memorize something that pops in your head when you see that, minus a negative is plus. Minus a negative is plus, always. Minus a negative is always plus or positive. And this could be the opposite of negative 2. And the opposite of negative 2 would be positive 2. So it's more than one way to say the same thing. Now, what happens when we throw the symbol of enclosure in down here? It still says, instead of saying minus negative 2, this is negative negative 2. Does it mean anything different? No, but when it looks different, it can confuse us. But the opposite of negative 2 is still positive 2. So all of those are multiple ways, sometimes to say exactly the same thing.